The morning Mara Voss became the wealthiest private citizen in the Terran Compact. She was standing in a shipping container in the dark, listening to rain tap against corrugated steel, trying not to breathe too loud. 3 months earlier, she had been in a different container, a conference room on the 48th floor of the Compact's orbital trade hub, all glass and recycled air, the kind of place where you could look down at Earth and feel like you'd won. She had been closing a licensing deal for a synthetic protein matrix that would feed 11 billion people on a planet, still rebuilding after the second dispersal. That morning, Mara had been the third highest-ranking procurement director in the history of the Ratique Colonial Trust. She had 2 homes, a small collection of pre-war art, and a daughter named Senna, who she called on Saturdays and visited twice a year if the schedules aligned. She had not thought on that morning that any of it could be taken from her. She had not thought specifically that it could be taken by something that didn't have hands. The Keth did not have hands. They had something closer to radial manipulation organs, 7 thin, semi-rigid appendages that could splay into a fan or compress into a point. Their bodies were roughly hexagonal in cross-section, pale gray-green, and they communicated through a low subsonic vibration that humans felt in the sternum before they heard it in the ears. They had arrived at the outer marker buoys of the system 17 months before and made no hostile move for 9 of them. The Compact's first contact teams had called that patience. The translation teams had spent 4 months building a partial phonemic dictionary before the Keth began to speak in actual words. The first thing the Keth said in that translated approximation was, "We have been watching your accumulation." No one in the initial contact team had understood what that meant. That was the first mistake. The Keth did not bomb cities. They did not blockade trade routes or threaten governments. What they did was far quieter and far more precise. Within 6 weeks of first formal contact, the wealthiest humans in the Compact began to die. It started with the Ultraric, the top 2,000 individuals by declared assets. A man named Auric Vance, the founder of 3 asteroid extraction guilds, was found in his habitat module in the outer belt with every blood vessel in his body dilated to maximum capacity, his skin a deep, luminous red, a look of profound surprise frozen on his face. He was worth 900 billion standard compact credits. Within 48 hours, the woman who inherited his holdings was dead in the same way. The wealth had become the vector. The science team scrambled. The best epidemiologists in the Compact ran every known pathogen screen and came back with nothing, because it wasn't a pathogen. It wasn't biological at all. It was something the Keth were doing at a distance that no one yet understood, a manipulation of some biological signal that the human body read as a catastrophic system failure, triggered by a specific kind of neural electrical signature, the signature of resource ownership, of accumulated worth. The Keth could sense it at range, could tune it, could amplify it until the human nervous system simply stopped. The news broke in waves. First it was a curiosity, then a crisis, then a panic. The wealthy did what wealthy people do in a panic. They tried to move their assets somewhere safe. They stripped their accounts, transferred holdings, signed wealth transfer documents at speeds that would have seemed insane in any other context. Some tried to give their money away. Some tried to burn it. Some tried to hide it in shell structures so complex that even they didn't fully understand the ownership chains. None of it worked. The Keth could track asset origin as easily as a hunter follows blood in snow. The wealth changed hands, but it didn't change nature, and the new holders began to die in turn. Mara had been in the 3rd tier of compact wealth, which bought her approximately 6 weeks of false security while the deaths cascaded down through the ultras and into the merely very rich. She had watched it happen on the feeds from her office window, from the transparent panels that looked out over the trade hub's main concourse, and she had done what almost everyone did in those first weeks. She had believed it was happening to other people. Then Sebastian Ratique signed over his company. Sebastian Ratique Sr. was the founder of the trust that employed her, the most powerful logistics company in the Compact, with holdings that would take a medium-sized planet 2 generations to match. He had spent 3 days after the first deaths calling in every favor he owned, trying to find a solution that money could solve, because that was the only kind of solution he knew how to look for. He found none. He signed his entire operation over to his son in a single document, in a ceremony that was supposed to make him safe. He was dead before the signature was certified. His son, Sebastian Jr., had lasted 11 hours with the inheritance before his hand started shaking and his teeth started to glow. That was the other symptom, the one no one had understood at first, the luminescence in the enamel that the Keth apparently used as a kind of targeting indicator. Sebastian Jr. had signed over the entire trust to the next person he could find with both standing and a clearance code. Mara Voss, his father's third procurement director, who had been trying to reach him for 2 hours about a routing problem in the Callisto depot. She had taken the paperwork. She had been too shocked to refuse. She had been too shocked to understand what she was holding until the glow started in her own back teeth. Faint but unmistakable, like 2 small stars lit in the back of her mouth, and the Keth signal hit her nervous system like a cold hand closing around her spine. Her assistant Tomas had pulled her out of the office. He was a compact man from one of the outer settlements, dark-eyed, with the kind of calm that comes from having already lost most of the things you might otherwise fear losing. He had 2 younger sisters on Callisto and a mother in an assisted living module in the belt, and when he looked at Mara in those first minutes, she could see him doing a calculation she recognized. Weighing loyalty against survival, finding that loyalty was something he could afford. She had not expected anyone to come with her. She had not asked. He had come anyway. They had fled the trade hub in a cargo shuttle with 3 other people from the trust's mid-management tier and a single duffel bag between them that held 3 days of rations, a medical kit, and a small piece of pre-war art Mara had grabbed from her wall without fully knowing why. A sculpture by a pre-dispersal artist, carved from asteroid iron, roughly the size of a fist. A man and a woman holding hands, or something that might be read that way if you turned it slightly to the right. She held it now in the dark of the shipping container, the steel surface cold against her palms, listening to the rain and to Tomas's breathing somewhere to her left, and she did not think about the $900 billion in assets that had followed her out of that building like a shadow she couldn't shake. She thought about Sina. She had called her daughter from the shuttle. Sina was 23, living in a habitat module on Titan with her partner and a small hydroponic garden she was turning into a real business. She was not wealthy. She was not wealthy at all. She had, in the years after Mara and her father separated, worked out the kind of functional independence that looked like distance until you needed it to be closeness. When Mara called, Sina had answered on the second ring, and she had said, not what Mara expected, not what she deserved. She had said, "Are you okay?" Mara had not cried then. She cried now, in the dark quietly, so Tomas wouldn't hear, pressing the iron sculpture against her sternum. The container was in a storage yard on Ganymede's northern flats, owned by a logistics subcontractor 3 times removed from anything connected to the trust. Tomas had arranged it through a network of favors that predated his employment with Mara by a decade. He had grown up poor in the way that was ordinary and dignified and required constant ingenuity, and he knew things about moving quietly through systems that Mara had never had to learn. She was learning them now. In the morning, the arbitrary morning they'd agreed on, ship standard time, because Ganymede's surface had no meaningful day-night cycle they cared about. Thomas set a small camp stove between 2 cargo pallets and made coffee with water from a recycler and actual ground beans from the duffel, which he had included because, he said, there was no point surviving if you had to do it like an animal. Mara drank the coffee standing up with both hands around the cup and said nothing for a long time. The Keth made another statement, Tomas said. He had a portable uplink, the kind that bounced through civilian relay satellites and left no registration trace. Third one this week. What did they say? Same thing. He looked at the floor. We have been watching your accumulation. This is the correction. The correction. That was what the Keth called it. Not a war, not a conquest, a correction. The way you might correct a machine that had developed a fault. As though the human habit of concentration, of pooling resources into the hands of fewer and fewer individuals, had registered to alien sensors as something pathological. A structural error in a species that had once worked another way and had, somewhere in the long centuries of expansion, forgotten how. Mara turned this over in her mind the way she'd been turning it over since they landed. She was an economist by training. Before she was an executive, she knew the theory. She knew what the graphs looked like. Wealth concentrating with each generation, rising with compound returns, the lower curves flatting. She had watched those graphs in graduate seminars and thought about them with the detachment of someone who expected to end up in the upper region. She had not thought about them from this angle, from the angle of being the problem. "Can they hear me?" she asked. It was a question she'd been afraid to voice. The researchers think they only track assets, Tomas said. Not the person. The ownership signal. So if I didn't own it? Yes. She looked at the sculpture in her hands. Who did you give the paperwork to? Tomas went very still in the way that meant he was deciding how much to say. I gave it to Pablo Estur, he said finally. The foreman at the yard. He's got 8 dependents and about 400 standard in his account, and he has no idea what I handed him. I filed it through a routing anomaly that'll take 3 auditors and a judge to unwind. By the time anyone figures it out, Thomas, the transfer is real, the assets are real. You don't own them anymore. He looked at her. The glow went out while you were asleep. She didn't know what to say. She looked at her hands, the small piece of iron, the man and woman, hand-holding, or maybe just leaning. You put an innocent man in the crosshairs, she said. I put Pablo Estur in possession of enough credit to fund a hospital for 30 years if he survives the paperwork. And I put a buffer between you and the signal. A pause. He has a family. He'll figure out what to do. It wasn't clean. She knew it wasn't clean. She would spend a long time in the coming weeks turning it over and not arriving at clean. But she was alive, and Senna was not yet at risk. On the 9th day in the container, Mara's daughter arrived. She had not asked Senna to come. She had not done the thing she was accustomed to doing with her daughter, which was to arrange a visit and a schedule and a clear endpoint so that neither of them had to sit with the discomfort of open time. Senna had simply arrived with a transit bag and the kind of matter-of-fact composure that Mara had always recognized as her father's temperament expressed in her daughter's face. She had brought food, actual food, protein packs from her own hydroponic stock, 3 different kinds of dried fruit, a small flask of something amber and strong that she handed to Mara without explanation. She had set up a sleeping mat in the corner of the container, with the efficiency of someone who had been on long transit before, which she had, because Mara had not been the parent who took her camping or to the outer settlements or anywhere that required sleeping on the ground. That had been someone else's job. Someone else who hadn't had the career Mara had. She drank the amber thing. Senna drank with her. Tomas found somewhere else to be. They're saying the Keth gave another statement today, Senna said. I know. They said they're prepared to stop. The accumulation falls below a certain threshold across the species. They gave a number. Sina looked at her. It's basically everyone having roughly similar amounts, plus or minus what you actually need to live. That's not how economies work. I know. You can't just dictate that. I know, Mom. People have spent centuries building. Mom, Senna said it gently. Not a rebuke. Just a pause. A hand placed on the conversation to stop it going somewhere it had already been. I'm not arguing with you. I just wanted to tell you what they said. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight without being hostile. Mara could hear the rain again. She had gotten used to the rain. She found she didn't mind it. Your garden, she said. The hydroponic operation. Yeah. Is it? She looked for the word that wasn't condescending and found the honest one instead. Is it working? Senna smiled. Not the polite smile she'd used throughout Mara's visits when Mara was asking about the garden the way you ask about a hobby. A real one. 3 new contracts this month. I'm at capacity for nitrogen-fixing crops and about 2/3 for leafy greens. I hired someone. A pause. She's really good. Mara nodded. The iron sculpture was on the floor between them. Sina picked it up, turned it. Where did this come from? I grabbed it when we left. Mara looked at it. It was in my office. I've had it for. I bought it when I got the 3rd directorship. 14 years. Senna turned it in the light. It's 2 people, or just the shape of 2 things that fit together, Mara said. The artist said it was ambiguous. I like it. Keep it, Mara said. Sina looked at her, the kind of look that asks if you mean it. Keep it, Mara said again. They slept that night in a row in the dark. Sina's arm against Mara's arm, and Mara lay awake for a long time, listening to the various small sounds of people she was responsible for breathing in the dark around her, and she thought about what the Keth were seeing when they looked at humanity, what the shape of the species looked like from outside, what a correction meant in language being translated between minds with no common reference point, trying to describe a diagnosis neither patient nor doctor had agreed on. She thought, maybe there was a version of this that wasn't punishment. Maybe there was a version where some alien intelligence, watching from across distances of unimaginable cold, had looked at the graphs she had studied in graduate school, the concentrating curves, the flattening lower lines, and had read them as a fever, a temperature, the body running hot in a way that bodies, left long enough, don't survive. She didn't know. She wasn't a xenobiologist. She was a procurement director who was no longer employed and no longer rich and was sleeping in a shipping container in the Ganymede North Flats with her daughter's arm against her arm. She thought that was probably enough to work with. In the second week, the Compact's first contact division made contact again with the Keth. Mara followed the broadcasts on Tomas's uplink, sitting cross-legged on a cargo pallet with a cup of coffee going cold on the floor beside her. The Compact's chief negotiator was a woman named Adara Pol, compact and gray-haired and ferociously precise, who had apparently been chosen because she had no personal wealth of any kind. She'd spent 30 years in public service and had the net worth of a well-kept museum. She communicated through a resonance translator, a device that converted human speech into the low subsonic that the Keth used. The Keth's response to Pol's first session had been 1 hour of silence, followed by a single phrase, "You are the kind we have been waiting for." Pol had replied, without apparent emotion, "Tell me what you want." The feed cut to analysis after that. The analysts speculated. The panic continued in other registers. Markets, refugee flows, the cascading consequences of sudden massive redistribution as wealth holders frantically transferred, often to people who had no infrastructure to manage it, spawning its own chaos. 3 colony systems on the outer margin had already filed emergency governance requests to the Compact because their local economies had been essentially inverted overnight. The middle tiers were the new wealthy, and they had no experience with the Keth's radar. Mara watched this and felt something she identified eventually as professional interest. Not detachment, she was too far from detachment for that, but the old pattern recognition she'd developed in procurement, the ability to see the structural logic in complex transactions. The Keth weren't randomizing the situation. They were, in fact, doing something quite precise. Every death had been calibrated. Every asset transfer had triggered a new targeting threshold rather than the old one. They were, in their way, running a compression algorithm on human wealth distribution. The curve was flattening, messily, traumatically, at enormous human cost, but flattening. She found herself wondering if the Keth had any concept of what it felt like from inside. She found herself wondering if that mattered to them. On day 19, Tomas made contact with one of the 3 other people who'd fled the trust with them, a supply coordinator named Eka, who had no significant wealth and had come along for reasons that had to do with Tomas and a history that Mara didn't have full context for. Eka had been moving through a series of community shelters in the Mid-Belt, helping to organize food distribution for the families of workers who'd been displaced by the economic collapse the Keth-related deaths had caused. She sent through a voice message, "The people doing best right now are the ones who've been doing this all along. Running community systems, watching out for each other, the mutual aid networks. They already knew how. The rest of us are learning." Tomas played the message twice and then turned off the uplink and sat with his hands together for a while. "She's right," he said. "Yes," Mara said. "I've been thinking." He stopped, restarted. "My sisters, on Callisto. They run a community kitchen, have for years. They've been feeding 140 people a day for the last 3 weeks because a lot of the mid-level workers there had their salaries collapse when their employers transferred assets and the companies stopped paying. Are they safe? They're not wealthy enough to be targeted." He said it without bitterness, just as a fact. The fact had a shape to it, a weight. They've never been wealthy enough to worry about that. Mara heard it. She let it sit. "I want to do something," she said. "I've been sitting in this container for almost 3 weeks, and I want to do something that isn't hiding." Tomas looked at her. "What kind of something?" "I have context for how the trust's logistics systems work. The routing, the depot networks, the distribution chains. A lot of that infrastructure is still functional, but nobody with any seniority is in a position to operate it because they're all either dead or hiding. The equipment is there. The supply chains are intact. What's broken is the organizational layer. You want to run supply chains for whoever needs them, for Eka's shelters, for your sisters, for the colony systems filing emergency governance requests." She looked at her hands, at the absence of the iron sculpture that she'd handed her daughter. "I know how to do this. I've been doing it for 30 years. I was very good at it. And I've been sitting in a shipping container trying to disappear for 3 weeks and watching people go hungry because the infrastructure is still there and there's nobody running it." Tomas was quiet for a long moment. "You'd be visible." "Yes, if anything about the asset transfer gets unwound." "I know." Another long pause. He looked at the floor, looked up. Okay, he said. I know some people. He knew more than some people. He knew, it turned out, a remarkably dense network of mid-level coordinators, technicians, depot managers, and logistics subcontractors who had been watching the same breakdown Mara had been watching and who needed, more than almost anything, someone with seniority and system access to serve as a coordination point. Mara set up a relay operation on the second day using the same bouncing satellite connection Tomas had been using, a portable terminal, and 47 years of combined logistics experience that she and Tomas could access between them. Sena stayed. Mara had not asked her to stay and had not asked her to leave, and Sena had apparently made her own calculation, contacting her partner on Titan and rearranging her hydroponic schedules and setting up a small secondary communications node from her transit bag that added 2 more relay paths to their network. She turned out to have skills that Mara hadn't known about and would have had no context for. The kind of distributed community-scale organization that was the opposite of everything Mara had spent her career doing. Bottom-up rather than top-down. Consensus rather than authority. She ran 3 regional food distribution briefings in the first 4 days, with a calm, focused authority that reminded Mara of something she couldn't quite name, until she recognized it as herself at 28, in the first procurement meeting where she'd had real responsibility. She hadn't been watching. She should have been watching. Her daughter had become extraordinary when she wasn't looking. The second contact session with the Keth happened on day 23. Adara Pol had apparently spent the intervening days in silence, too. Not diplomatic silence, but actual silence. Sitting with the resonance translator and listening to the subsonic output of the Keth vessel in the way you sit with music you don't understand yet, trying to let it mean something before you ask what it means. The Keth apparently had a word for this practice. The translation approximation was closest to something like receiving without yet naming. Their statement at the beginning of the second session was, "You are learning." Pol had said, "We have not stopped." The Keth's response to that had been, according to the analysts, a subsonic pattern that had no direct translation, but that the emotional resonance team interpreted as something like, "That is what we are watching for." The deaths continued, but the rate was changing. Not stopping, changing. The threshold was lower now. The curve had compressed. The correction was not finished. But there was something in the spacing of the targeting, in the parameters the Keth seemed to be applying, that suggested, not proved, that they were watching for something beyond just the redistribution of assets. They were watching for what people did with changed circumstances. What the species looked like when it was not arranging itself the way it had been arranged. Mara did not sleep much during that period. She slept in short intervals and worked in the intervals between, and she felt not well, not safe, not anything with a clean label. She felt engaged. In the way that work you are actually necessary to feels engaging. Not the performance of necessity that came with managing large portfolios from glass offices above the concourse, but the stripped-down actual necessity of being the person who knows which depot in the Callisto system has the right transit containers, and which route bypasses the inspection point that's currently overwhelmed, and which subcontractor can be reached on a civilian relay without flagging a tracking algorithm. She called in favors she'd forgotten she had. She called in relationships that had nothing to do with formal authority, and everything to do with years of treating people like they were worth remembering. She found in this that she had more than she'd thought. In week 5, Eka's voice message was a recording of a meal. 237 people in a repurposed shuttle hangar in the inner belt, eating food that had come through a routing chain that Mara had designed, and Tomas had built, and Sena had helped maintain. You couldn't hear the food. You could hear the people, the particular, ordinary sound of people eating and talking and occasionally laughing at something Mara couldn't make out. Tomas played it and didn't say anything. Sena said, "That's 237 more than nothing." Adara Pol's third session with the Keth happened on day 31. The opening this time was different. The Keth spoke first. "Show us your accumulation now." Pol had apparently prepared for this. She had prepared it by not preparing any particular response, but by arriving with actual documentation, not compact diplomatic records or political position papers, but the outputs of the distributed networks, the community kitchen records, the supply chains, the numbers of people being fed by infrastructure that had been rebuilt, in a matter of weeks, by the people who had never had enough to begin with, now working alongside the people who had lost what they'd had. The curve, she showed them. Different now, different enough to see. The Keth had been quiet for what the contact team described as a very long time. Their response, when it came, was in the lower register of their subsonic range, the one that the emotional resonance team associated with something like satisfaction, or more precisely, with the sentiment of watching a process resolve, as predicted. "We see it," they said. It was not an ending. The targeting did not stop that day. The threshold did not go to zero. The Keth made no declaration of peace and issued no new guarantees, because those were human categories that may not have mapped onto what the Keth were doing. But the rate of incidents dropped sharply in the following week, and the following week after that, and in the Compact's emergency session, convened by political leaders who were themselves no longer wealthy enough to be at risk. 3 separate economic reform packages were passed in a single session that would have taken a century of ordinary political time, because the people in the room had been watching the correction happen, and they knew, with the particular clarity of fear, that the old arrangements were not going to be available to them anymore. Mara watched the session on Tomas's uplink from the container. Senna sat beside her. Tomas made coffee. She was thinking about Pablo Estur, the foreman who now technically held the assets of the Ratique Colonial Trust and who had apparently been located by a compact auditor, had reportedly handled the initial conversation with a composed and slightly bewildered dignity, and had then retained a lawyer and begun consulting with the same network of mutual aid coordinators that Mara had been working with for the past month about what to do with resources of that scale. She was thinking about a man she'd never met, holding something she'd spent a career accumulating, and doing something with it she couldn't have imagined for herself. She was thinking about the fact that she was not dead. She was thinking about her daughter's arm against her arm in the dark, and about the iron sculpture that Senna had in her bag, and about the way 2 shapes could look like people holding hands, or just like 2 things that happened to fit together. And maybe there wasn't as much difference between those 2 readings as she'd always assumed. On the 52nd day, Senna went home. Her partner had been managing the hydroponic operation alone for 2 months and was running the nitrogen fixing capacity close to failure without the second set of hands. She had 2 contracts to fulfill and a 3rd hire to orient, and she needed to be there for it. She had stayed 6 weeks longer than made practical sense, and neither of them mentioned that directly. She hugged Mara at the container door in the gray light of Ganymede's morning shift, and Mara held on for longer than she usually did, and Senna let her. "Come see me," Senna said. "Actual visit. Not crisis visit. Come see the garden." "I will," Mara said. And then, because honesty had stopped feeling like a luxury she couldn't afford, "I should have come years ago." Sina pulled back and looked at her. That look again, the one that wanted to know if she meant it. "I know," Sina said finally. "Come in the spring." She had a specific orbital season in mind, one that corresponded to the period when her leafy greens were at peak yield, which was a completely irrational frame for planning a visit and which Mara would have found slightly absurd 6 months ago. She found she was looking forward to it. She stood at the container door and watched her daughter's transit bag disappear around the corner of the storage yard, and then she went back inside and sat down across from Tomas. "Next routing call is in 4 hours, he said. He had a thermal cup of coffee ready for her on the pallet beside his seat, which he'd started doing at some point without her registering when. "I know," she said. Outside, the rain had stopped. The Ganymede flats were very flat under a sky the color of old pewter, the settlement lights making small pools of amber in the distance. There was a supply convoy coming in from the Callisto depot. She could see the running lights, carrying protein packs and nitrogen-fixing substrate, and a cargo of recycled hull panels that a habitat extension project in the Midbelt needed. She had arranged this convoy. She had made 7 calls and drawn on 4 different favor networks and argued one reluctant depot manager into releasing materials he'd been holding back for his own site's emergency reserves, convincing him, ultimately, not by invoking her authority, but by explaining clearly how the distribution balanced out, why his own emergency reserves would be replenished faster if the hub network held, why they each needed the other to exist. He had understood. He had agreed. The convoy had departed. She watched its lights cross the gray distance and felt nothing she would describe as triumph. She felt the quiet thing that comes after work that was worth doing. the specific satisfaction of a system running because someone knew which parts needed to be in which place and had made sure they were. Tomas handed her the uplink. The relay feed showed the contact team's monitoring station, the ambient graph of Keth's subsonic emissions, which the analysts had been charting against what looked like a long, slow exhalation, a pressure releasing, a breath being let out. They were watching the Keth. They had been watching the whole time. Mara drank her coffee and watched the convoy lights and listened to the feed and thought, fine, watch. We'll show you something worth watching. Not the spectacle of the correction. Not the panic and the death and the cascade of desperate asset transfers. The other thing, the part that comes after, when the people who know how to be poor, who have always known how, who built their whole lives around systems that worked without requiring anyone to have too much, start teaching the ones who are just learning. We'll show you what we are when we are not what we've been. We'll show you what we can do when we stop trying to keep. She looked at the lights, the convoy settling into the landing approach, the amber warmth of the settlement behind it, small and human, and implausibly tenacious, in the dark of a moon that was not built for them, and in which they lived anyway, as they had been living in places they were not built for since before they remembered how to count the years. She thought, we're not great because we accumulate, we're here because we adapt. And she thought, someone across an unimaginable distance is watching to see if we know that about ourselves. She thought, we might. She held the warmth of the cup in her hands and watched the convoy complete its approach. And outside the container walls, the lights came on in the settlement at the start of another ship-standard morning. And somewhere Senna was on a transit shuttle with an iron sculpture in her bag and spring contracts to fulfill. And somewhere Pablo Estur was in a room with a lawyer trying to figure out what you do with 900 billion credits when you've spent your whole life learning to do without. And somewhere Adarapol was sitting in silence with a resonance translator, waiting to say something that didn't need to be said yet. The Keth were watching. Mara Voss, who had once been the third highest-ranking procurement director in the history of the Ratique Colonial Trust, and who was now a woman in a shipping container with good coffee and useful work, and a daughter she was going to visit in the spring, turned back to the terminal. 4 hours until the routing call. She began to prepare.